intro.
Oh, that's all right. No worries. I think we got it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Story DNA Hangouts. I am Kathy Klotz-Guest of Keeping It Human, and my partner in crime, my fun friend Brian Carter. Shout out to him. He's couldn't make it today. He's busy. He just moved as well, so which I don't envy. But we miss him, and we will have fun enough for two. I will have fun enough for me and him today because we have a great guest. I'm really excited to be able to chat storytelling with somebody whose work I followed for a long time. She's a prolific curator. She's an author. She's the author of Business Storytelling for Dummies. Her business is juststoryit.com, and that is Karen Dietz. And welcome to StoryDNA, Karen.
Hey, Kathy, how are you? It's so good to be with you.
I know. I was telling Karen before we went live, it's like, I love the world of social media today because I've met so many people and I feel like I get to know them through the work they do, the stories they tell, their voice, their personality online. And then I meet them and I'm like, they're just as great. And I'm like, which is great because it means the person that you sort of are out there in social media really maps to who you are in person. And it's just really lovely. So it's yay. So we're going to talk all kinds of good stuff with Karen about storytelling. She's been doing storytelling a long time. She's a seasoned storyteller. She's a storyteller's storyteller. She's a woman after my own storytelling heart. So we're going to jump on in, and I'm going to start with a question that I like to throw out there just to frame it. You know, we bandy about the word storytelling, Karen, so much today, and sometimes we're not all talking the same thing because storytelling is very broad, and yet it can also mean something really amazing when we're talking about a narrative construct. So how do you define storytelling? Boil the ocean.
That's funny. Oh, geez. Let me count the ways. You know, what's interesting is that because storytelling is so broad,
yeah,
and it's a part of the human experience, right? It's part of what makes us human. And then its application can be so broad in so many different areas in business and personal relationships. And then just within business, so many different applications, leadership, training, corporate culture, marketing, branding. I mean, we could just go on.
Yeah.
That I think the better way to think about a definition for storytelling is a definition that fits the activity that you're engaged in.
Mm.
And I think that there are two ways to look at a definition of storytelling, and one is sort of the mechanical way. What makes a good story? List all the elements, right? So it's a recipe, sort of the elements that you need, that it's really mechanical.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's sort of like paint by numbers.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make great art, for lack of a better analogy. And then you have another way to define storytelling, which is based on story dynamics, which is how is storytelling an active, ongoing, engaging experience between two or more people that creates meaning, develops relationship, and ultimately builds a business.
Yeah.
And the mechanics, you need to know the mechanics, but in order to be successful, you need to work with the dynamics, which is what you do in improv. Right? And so if we think of storytelling in that way, then when we're looking at an application, we can say, okay, well, what kinds of story mechanics work in this situation? And what are the story dynamics that I need to pay attention to? And that way, you really are able to leverage what needs to happen right then and there around storytelling.
Yeah.
So then I have, that's one way to think, one way to answer that question. And then the other way is to say, what I tell everybody is that I do not like the word storytelling.
Spoken like a true storyteller.
I know. I don't like the word because, what it does is it conjures up a picture in everybody's brain about somebody standing up and telling, right?
Yeah.
Telling things to us.
Yeah.
when really the magic in storytelling is in story sharing.
Yeah.
Which
That's a great way to put it.
yeah. I tell a story, it sparks a story in you. I get to listen to that. You listen to me. So it's a dynamic again that goes on,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I think true storytelling is.
Mm-hmm. That's a great definition. I really love that. I love that you started off by saying, you know, it's marketing, it's branding, it's culture, because it is all those things. And I came actually out of high tech, and I came not only from world of improv, but I came from world of marketing, and my background was marketing and branding. And I've always believed that story is bigger. Story is bigger than all of those things. Story is, it's the very DNA, hence story DNA of how a company operates. And you know, it's really this bigger thing. And I also love that you defined it in terms of mechanics and dynamics and all these moving parts, because you know, you're so right. When we say storytelling, it's very funny to me that a lot of the companies I talk to, and I'm sure you probably see this a lot, they look at storytelling as not only an outbound or a marketing function, oftentimes like brand, like it's somehow immersed under the branding thing, rather than a leadership and who we are in the world thing. They also look at it as, yeah, somebody getting up to a podium and talking at you, just exactly as you said, versus the fact that it's really the stories that you tell are shaped and changed by the audience who receives it. And it's an ongoing thing. It's not this static thing that, oh, I told a story. Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. And I love that you say that in so many words. It's you story share, and then the audience helps you change it because they mirror back to you something really special. So the person who tells a story, or the organization who tells a story, at some point needs to be changed by that story.
Absolutely.
It's such an ongoing it's a participative kind of thing. And that's what I love about what you just said, because I think that's so true. And I think you may not have an improv background, I don't know, but you're an improviser at heart.
Yes. I've taken a few improv classes, but I don't come to improv through that classical, you know, kind of way. And what's really interesting is when I coach speakers.
Yeah.
Part of the coaching is, well, if you're going to tell a story, how do you prepare to listen to the stories that people want to come up to you and tell you later?
Oh, yeah.
And the same way it goes with leaders when I work with leaders. How do you prepare for that? Yeah. Because very often we think, oh, okay, I've given my speech, boom, I'm done, walk off the stage, boom.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what happens.
Yeah.
I mean, because then you have people coming up to you, and if you don't have the tolerance and if you don't have the awareness for listening to those people's stories, then once again, you're going to miss a huge leverage point in building your business. Or for a leader, a huge leverage point in building their organization, in building engagement, in building authenticity and executive presence and what have you. Yeah, when I work with executives, I always say, okay, listen, you think you're going to be telling stories like a bunch of the time, when actually 70% of your time is going to be spent listening for stories.
Yeah. Isn't that, and that's such a great way to frame it, because that's exactly what it is. Your job just starts. Your job just starts the minute you've told a story, because now you're going to have to, if you did it well, it sparks something in the audience that hears it, who, to your point, exactly, they'll want to share their story. And great storytelling is a collaborative process, because I think a company who hears from its rabid fans can't help but be changed by the way that their audience is hearing, perceiving, and acting out, or contributing to that story, and how they interpret that story and make it theirs. So then if you've done your job well, you've created a structure that other people can adopt. And that's, I think, what great storytelling can and should be. It's interesting how that there is that mindset. I think some people think it's, well, I've told my story and it's done. Well, it's a living, breathing, I think, organism in some ways that really changes over time.
I know. I crack up when leaders tell me, I know, okay, let's get this story down. We'll videotape it. We'll be done. And I go, wait, back up. That's probably the last thing you want to do.
Yeah.
And I give them all the reasons why, but But you know, marketing is suffering from this
Yeah.
same kind of mentality too,
Yes.
right?
Oh, yes.
And let's just kind of like the old push technologies, right?
Yeah.
When we know storytelling is a pull technology, we pull people into our worlds.
Yeah.
But a lot of marketing and advertising for decades has been let's push messages out. And so changing that mindset is a big deal. And finally, I'm starting to hear some chatter in the marketing community. Oh, we need to listen to the stories that are being told back to us and work with those.
Yes.
And I go, yeah.
There's a concept. It's funny. No, it's true. I think marketing's interpretation of story, I think, and I'll just sort of lay down the gauntlet, I think is very superficial. We've just scratched the surface, I think, of what great storytelling can be, because we've not gotten vulnerable and real, and we've not listened to the audience. I'm curious from your perspective, Karen, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, and you see a lot of things, what do you think is missing from great business storytelling? What does it have to do to really get to that next level of potential?
You've hit a hot button.
Yeah, it's one with me too. I see stories and I go, oh, this is not a story.
Oh, this is
not a story. Well, and you're more polite than I am. You're more polite. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of words I could say.
Yeah,
Not a story.
Well, here's what I think about that. Is that storytelling is very accessible to everybody, right? It's the most accessible art form there is on the planet, because we think in stories, we talk in stories. So when somebody says, oh yes, let's make a story for marketing or for branding, what's our story and what have you, they think, oh, they know how to craft a story. And what we have is either a majority of mediocre storytelling or worse. And it's hard, Lori Silverman and I, when we wrote the book, Business Storytelling for Dummies, we wanted to bring lots of examples in to the book for everything that we were pointing out and saying, examples of companies doing good storytelling, and it was exceedingly difficult to find good examples. And what people don't realize is that storytelling takes training. Just like everybody can sing, if you want to sing well, you go take some voice lessons. Mm-hmm. If you are a good writer and you want to be a published writer, then you go take some classes in writing. Right? So you can tell a story when you're talking with your friends, but if you want to up your game and really make an impact with your storytelling and leverage it to the hilt, then you need storytelling training. And the only way to become a great storyteller is through telling lots of stories and doing lots of practice. So 1 2-hour workshop on what needs to go into a story does not cut it.
Yeah. Right.
And if there's anything that people need to pay attention to, it's the quality of their storytelling training. And I've had companies come to me and say, oh, great, let's get some storytelling training. And then bottom line, they're not really willing to commit the time, money, or resources to get it done the way that they want. And then they go, oh, well, yeah, we did a 2-hour or half day, storytelling workshop, and, it just didn't really work for us.
Yeah.
And I just kind of going, yeah, your head's in the wrong place.
Yeah. It's really true. And a lot of what I see out there, I think it's a lack of understanding, a lack of willing to commit to go deeper.
Yeah.
And we want the marketing story, get it out now because we're in lead generation. It's all about demand generation versus the idea that a story fundamentally it's transformational if you do it right, which
absolutely
means
is.
it cannot be a marketing function. It's got to be backed up further in the organization at a cultural, at a organizational, at a leadership level that really says, who are we? Because if we're just putting out these marketing stories to do lead gen, but they have no connection back to who we are as a company, we're missing the boat. And that's the fragmentation that I see. And I just scratch my head and I go, I don't see where the marketing tactics you're using and the really shallow stories you're telling serve your bigger story. Right. And I think there is a disconnect. There's a big disconnect, I think, with the way that marketing thinks about storytelling, but with the way that companies think about storytelling on average.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know the big push for generating content, and then you look at the content and you kind of go, okay, what's the real story here? And then when somebody likes the content on Facebook, it's like, oh, great, they're telling their story back to us.
Right. Yeah.
Or they made a comment, love the article. Oh, great, Or we see reviews on TripAdvisor, and those are stories.
Yeah.
And so it's all convoluted. People don't have well, let me put it this way, is that since the question was about what upgrades can happen, in the world of business storytelling, I think it's understanding what a story really is, knowing a quality story when you hear it, see it, feel it, and then being able to improve your storytelling skills so that you can get the maximum value over your activity. There's another thing that you said that sparked another thing, another idea or thought in my head, which is that most organizations enter into the world of storytelling at the transactional level.
Yes.
And part of our work as story practitioners is to understand, okay, this is where you enter into the system, but where we got to go is out of the transactional level and into the relational level and then into the transformational level.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. And it's okay, to your point, to have an entry point that is more immediate, to get more immediate feedback at the transactional level. But if the connection's never made further up the food chain, where it can be so impactful, where it really has the opportunity to really change the company, then it kind of is all for naught. And I think that, and I speak for myself here, I will own it. That's, I think, where my frustration today with what I see when people call it a marketing story, and I think, wow, you've just scratched the surface. And if you really wanted to go deeper and be vulnerable and actually really have a story that's really emotionally resonant, you've got to go deeper, because this is just like it's okay as far as maybe a marketing campaign goes, but in the world of storytelling, it just doesn't pass muster. It doesn't pass the emotional sniff test, if you will. And I think, you could go deeper. And I think, do you see signs that business storytelling, Karen, is headed that direction? I mean, you mentioned earlier, and I've had the same issue where you said it was really hard to find good examples in business storytelling. That seems to be the case when I talk to people. Are there any beacons of hope out there where you see organizations really doing some amazing stuff here?
I think the organizations that I am most excited about are organizations that start with storytelling internally.
Yeah.
And so I love talking with Richard Sheridan at Menlo Innovations up in Michigan, the author of Joy, Inc., and the kind of storytelling that goes on in their organization and how that has led to exponential growth over the years, and all kinds of awards for their organization, international awards. And so here you've got an example of a great storyteller, fabulous, strong culture, and business results, bottom line financial results that all kind of work hand in hand together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a great example. Another great example is Nike.
Yeah.
And I've talked with his last name is Ferris. What's his? Anyway, I must not have had enough coffee this morning. It's like, oh my God, I know this guy. Why can't I think of him? It's like, you know, not remembering your Aunt Mabel's name.
And you'll remember it the minute you get off the podcast. I know how it is. Because I do that. I do that too. That means your brain has so much great information in it.
I know. Nelson Ferris. Ugh, duh.
There you go. There you go.
I sometimes forget my husband's name and have to say, hey, you over there. Very bad. But anyway, so Nelson Ferris at Nike, another fabulous storyteller who has helped build, along with his compatriots, you know, a real strong storied culture that shows in their marketing and advertising. I mean, if ever there's a company that sparks stories in their audience, right? Mm-hmm. Be all that you can be, just do it, you know, things of that sort. Well, be all you can be, that's the Army, but there's another one that they do.
We get you.
I know. But anyway, those are two great examples. Yeah. And I know that there are others out there.
Yeah. There are, and the ones that I can immediately think of, Karen, it's probably similar to what you're seeing. It's like I keep coming back to consumer, the world of consumer kind of brands, if we want to kind of label it that way. I think we're all people, but you know, it's really, you know, human beings sell to other human beings. But if we're going to label it this way, it's the business to consumer world has great examples of storytelling based on culture. You know, I think about Tom's Shoes, or I think about Warby Parker, which is really popular with millennials right now, but they're standing for something bigger than themselves. And there's no reason whatsoever that this can't apply to a B2B setting. And I'm not sure why there's still that barrier there. And I do think the walls are coming down, but it's not coming down quickly. And there's still this strange mentality, which is fear of risk, risk aversion, fear of decentralization, like somehow they've lost control of the story. And I always have to remind them that they never really controlled the story in the first place. So there's a false sense of control. And in B2B, I think it's a mindset issue, because there's certainly no reason we can't have more great B2B brands telling great stories. But I don't see that in the same way that I see in the consumer space. I mean, what are you seeing, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think B2B is one of the last strong bastions of business speak.
Yeah.
And the reliance on technical language.
Yes.
And technical competence to make a sale or to build the business. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you add storytelling into the mix, then you leapfrog over your competition. And I just don't think we have enough good examples.
Yes.
And that people would recognize.
That's right.
And acknowledge. The one that comes closest to my mind is Intel.
Yes. Yeah.
And the stories they tell about Intel Inside.
Yes.
Now, we hear those ads because there is something about the consumer wanting a good chip in their computer, right? But they build their business by selling to other, you know, computer manufacturers, selling their chips, right? And so it's more of a B2B company than a B2C company.
Yeah. Good point. And you know, I have noticed a sea change. That's interesting, because I think you're right. I mean, about 2 years ago, I noticed that Intel started sharing stories in a very surprising way. And you wouldn't have thought that out of a behemoth, you know, the size of Intel. And you know, such a strong technology company. but it is a strong consumer brand. It's in the top 10 of well-known, worldwide renowned brands. And there's something about Intel they do get. And I started seeing about 2 years ago more stories focused on the audience. How to unlock your creative genius. Like, there's a genius in everybody. Everybody has their own inner engineer and genius, whatever it is. And whatever that is, Intel can be a part of the technology you use to do your genius thing.
Yeah.
And it was really surprising and refreshing from Intel to see them celebrate their audience in a way that I hadn't seen before. You know, so you're right. I think it's great. I'm also hoping that one day when we talk about B2B examples, we'll have a lot more examples.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, other than that, but yeah. Where do you think it's going to go? Where do you think the future of business storytelling really needs to go? What are some of the impediments that you think have to be knocked down for business storytelling, call it 2.0, 3.0, whatever? It's been around a long time, to really be meaningful in a way that you and I are talking about, that we know is possible.
Right. That's there's probably a number of different answers to that question, and a few things come to mind. We already mentioned better training.
Yeah.
And more prolonged training.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a storyteller and I still take storytelling workshops, just like you still perfect your craft in improv.
No doubt.
That's just not something that's not ever going to go away.
No way.
Because you have to stay sharp.
Yeah.
And part of working with stories is understanding how to renew the tired ones, find new ones. You know, put the ones that no longer should be told, you know, into the storage closet. And so there's more to storytelling than just, here, let me sit down and write a story for my blog post. So I think training is one aspect of it. I think there's also training, perhaps, of story practitioners. And so that we get better quality work done out there. Right now, there's not really a place for people to go to get trained in being a professional person who works with stories in organizations or in business. Right? I came to it through being a folklorist, having a doctorate in folklore, and then moving over into the business world and learning all that business stuff from the School of Hard Knocks. You know, other people come to it from marketing, or like you, from improv, or others through knowledge management. And in the early days, you know, I could count all the practitioners on both hands, you know. And then it got to be both hands twice. Right. And now there are hundreds of thousands of people who are hanging out their storytelling shingle because it's marketable. Yeah. And they have some skills, but they may not have a full range of skills that they might need. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is maybe, you know, different kinds of training for developing story practitioners, story professionals.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point you just made, is that everybody brings a different lens, and that can be really wonderful. But to the discipline as a whole, are we advancing the larger goals of storytelling within organizations if there's a lot of fragmentation in the way it's practiced? And that's a really important point.
Right.
And I think I think you're right. And I also think, you know, leaders need to think about the relationship they have with story in a fundamentally different way.
Right.
I think the really smart people, you just mentioned a couple, Joy Inc. sounds incredible. And there are organizations out there like Nike, to your point, that very much understand that look, as an executive, I'm a steward of it, but I don't own the story. And yet there's so many organizations out there that I talk to that sadly don't get that. They are but stewards and champions of the story, but they do not own that story. And so you end up having marketing think that they own it, and the executives think that they own it. And what they're missing, this command and control kind of mentality, really, really, they don't understand is hurting their storytelling.
Yes, absolutely. So to your point, I think that, well, I'm working on 2 other projects that hopefully will help in that area.
Yeah.
And one is I've been working for the past 2 years on developing new storytelling design principles based on story dynamics. So instead of the mechanical design principles, you know, beginning, middle, and end, problem resolution, conflict, climax, you know, all of that sort of stuff. It's necessary. We need to know that stuff. But if we want to up our game, then how do we think of designing a story from the using different kinds of principles that come out of story dynamics?
Yeah.
So I'm working on that. So that hopefully will help us elevate the quality of storytelling that we see coming from companies. And then there's another part that I'm working on, which is what I call the story maturity model, which is what happens when an organization first engages with storytelling, and how does storytelling need to grow within the organization in order to maximize all of its benefits. And so you start out in marketing at a transactional level, but then as the organization says, oh, wow, that really worked. What can we do now? I mean, what's the next step? Then you have a sort of a pathway to bringing storytelling from the transactional into the relational and into the transformational. And so there's a clear path for doing that.
You said something really interesting. I mean, you always say interesting stuff, but it struck me as you were talking that, you know, the shelf life maybe of stories too. When you talk about and I love this concept you're working on of a maturity model, because I think that's really important for people to perceive storytelling as having a pathway, because they don't know where to start. But then there's also, they don't know when to retire stories. And I start thinking about these life cycle. And in marketing, we talk a lot about product life cycles and the life cycle of a campaign where it kind of, you know, levels off and the novelty's gone. And I think the same is true of stories. And I don't know that people know when and how to change stories. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think you're onto something really, really important. You know? Right.
A part of my storytelling process, I call it the charm model, right? and because we got to get charming, we got to work our charm, and we want to be charming in our stories. But C stands for, you know, collecting your stories. And then the H stands for honing your stories. The A stands for applying your stories. The R stands for renewing your stories. And then the M stands for mining your stories, you know, digging deep into your stories and figuring out what's really going on there. Because there's multiple meanings, multiple messages embedded in stories. But the renewing stories is really, really important. And storytellers know this pretty intimately because we have our favorite stories to tell, and we're up on stage, and well, what happens if one day there's just no juice for that story? Well, your audience will tell. They can tell when that story is not alive for you, and they won't be able to engage with it like they want, and so they will be disappointed, and so will you. And then the work that story has to do in the world no longer is viable. So being in constant relationship with your story and being aware of how you are with that story is really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
There are times when, after telling a story for a while, you go, I am bored with this story, right? Or I just can't get the energy up to tell it, right? When I try to tell it, it just falls flat.
Right.
And so the first thing to do when you're in that experience is to say, okay, then that's not the story I should be telling.
Yeah.
Just because it's a habit doesn't mean that I need to say it again.
Yes.
Right? Particularly when I'm not feeling the love for that story anymore.
If you got no passion, you should not be telling that story.
Right. So then you get to ask yourself, well, is it just because of the day, the environment, the audience that I'm in front of? You know, what are the factors that are, sometimes you're just really tired and that story just is not. So you have to start asking yourself, okay, well then what story do I want to tell?
Yeah.
And you have to stop yourself and not tell that story that you thought you were going to tell.
Yeah.
And then once you do that, then the next step is, all right, let's look at the story, and maybe there's more to why I don't want to tell it, right? Or I'm bored with it. Maybe I can use a different story structure and change the story around and tell the same story but in a different way. And maybe that will be a fun, creative thing for me to do, and I'll find new juice for that, right? New juice for telling that story. Or maybe, I've told this story for years. There's a certain key message to it. I keep telling that key message, but maybe I need to look at the story again and see if there's something else that's embedded in this story, a different kind of message. And maybe I need to retire that first one and start telling the story with the ending and the key message a little differently. So that's another way to renew the story, right? So there are a couple other tricks, and things to do. And then if all else fails, you just retire it. And you say, okay, that I'm done with that story, and I just don't want to tell it anymore. I have one story that I tell about my mom before she died, and it's kind of it's a story that's both tragic and humorous at the same time. And there are only certain sets of conditions that can be in place where I can tell that story and have it really work, right? And so I honor that. And it's the same for any story, right?
So true. So true. And it's, especially when, stories are sacred, and many of them are, depending on the story. And you need to honor the conditions which serve that story, where the people who are gonna hear it, it's an honor for them versus, sharing your story with somebody who may not, or an audience that may not, get it or appreciate it. And that's something that you have to really be aware of, very self-aware of what the conditions are for a particular story to work.
Right. I've known storytellers who've gone on stage and they've got their playlist down. This is the stories I know I'm going to tell, and they're out on stage and they get a read on the audience.
Yeah.
Or something happens and they abandon that whole set.
Yeah.
And they're in the moment telling the story that needs to be told for that particular audience.
Yeah.
That's improv, right?
That's improv.
That's a type of improv.
Yeah, it is.
And what I love about storytelling that most people don't recognize, you would recognize this, other storytellers recognize this, but storytelling is a co-created experience between you and your audience. And there is that removal of the fourth wall that happens in theater.
Yeah.
Right. And that fourth wall is whatever that invisible wall is between you and your audience. You're not there performing a story.
Right.
You are there sharing a story and engaged with your audience at the same time.
Yeah. That's it. You just described it so eloquently, and I think that affects storytellers differently. And to be aware of that, because when you've told, the danger of telling a story so much is that it can become so rote that when we deliver it, we're lacking the real emotional resonance to connect with that audience.
Right.
And that's where being able to, in that moment, improvise and is such a valuable skill. I remember I think it was the 2012 Democratic Convention. Bill Clinton was a speaker, and NPR did a story on his appearance at the convention. And what he had done is that he had a whole bunch of stories and a whole bunch of things he wanted to share with the audience. They actually published the redacted, the words he actually gave and what he had planned. 80%, Karen, of what he had planned to say to that audience, he didn't use. He changed in the moment, because in that moment, and they dubbed him the improviser in chief, which I loved. And,
yes.
And his ability to read an audience and to say, what I planned and the energy and the emotion that I'm sensing in the moment don't match. So I'm going to go off script, which is music to my improviser heart, and tell some different stories. And I love that, because stories are so much, to your point, about feeling the audience and having them with you on that journey. And if you know that a certain story isn't going to have the emotional investment for the audience, you can't take them on that journey with you. And that's such a sense thing, that live, being present in the moment, being able to drop that and do a different story. And that's something that's part of the dynamic of delivering storytelling that you just need practice at.
Right. And that applies for live telling, as let's say a leader or a manager or anybody in an organization doing that live with a group of people. It also applies to content marketers, right? Content creators, because it's so easy to get on that, this is my publishing schedule, and completely ignore what the signs and signals are out there that you need to respond to and connect with.
Yeah.
And the only danger I see in that from the marketing perspective is that there are a lot of tools out there that will tell you, what's popular at this time. And so if you want to create a piece of content, you have to, kind of speak to what's trending at the time in order to get the shares and what have you. And that comes across so disingenuous.
It does. And there's leading and lagging indicators. I think content marketers are too much chasing whatever's topical at the moment, rather than understanding where a conversation is heading and where they should be at, because that story may have peaked, and any attempt to sort of tap into that story, to your point, is transparent, and it just doesn't feel real.
Right.
And I love the way you said it, because it's true. It's really a co-created thing with your audience, and that's what great storytelling is. And if I saw more content marketers doing that, and that's the danger. It's the beauty, but it's also the dark sided, underbelly and double sword of, I think, all these automated tools is that I'm not sure they're serving the living story.
That's true. That's true. But Kathy, what do you think needs to happen in the field? I mean, what kind of upgrades do you see are really critical on the horizon?
I think the big things, it's interesting. I just wrote a LinkedIn post yesterday on this topic, because it's been on my mind a lot through conversations like we're having now, really great conversations. I think a couple things have to happen. I think the walls in organizations need to come down, because the best storytellers, I've always believed, internally are not in the executive suite. They're the people closest to the front lines. They're the people who talk to customers every day. And I still see such siloed control issues over the story and who owns the story. And that, if more leaders could just step up and say, look, it's my job to stoke the flame, but I don't own the story. It's my employees that own the story, because they show up every day and they either buy into the internal story or they don't. And they have to make it their own. I think that has to happen. There's a mind shift that has to happen there. And it's a decentralization of the storytelling process, and let my best employees talk, because they're going to be the most credible. They're going to be the best storytellers, and they're going to be the ones that my customers recognize as, wow, that person's a lot like me. And that's got to happen. And I think the other part of it is that storytelling to me, I've said before, I think we're at storytelling light right now in the business world.
Yeah.
We're at some kind of like, light version of what it could be. And I think more vulnerability, just too many stories they're either, look how great we are. They're not vulnerable. They don't talk about the failure. They're also too packaged with the perfect resolution bow, and they're too manufactured. And we all know that life is messy, and stories sometimes are not perfect. And that's because companies are in transition and they're constantly evolving. And it's okay to say to your audience, look, we're a company in transition. We don't know where the future holds, but we think it's going to be this, and we're moving towards that. And we don't have the perfect ending, but you know what? We want to work with you to help create that together.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that, to me, that inviting your audience to participate in that is missing to me. It's just completely not there.
Yes.
And I got to tell you, I'm just so much with you when, people go, hey, check out our story. And you just want to cringe because you're like, that's not a story. That's not a story. And it's like, you don't want to tell them that their baby's ugly and it doesn't belong in the refrigerator with a magnet. You're like, it's like, I know. Want to say that to you because you're so proud of it. But I think it just needs to get to that level of participation and openness and vulnerability and letting employees, it's a control thing. It's just the doors have to explode on it. And I'm waiting for that to happen. And I sadly, I think it can happen. I just don't see enough in the B2B space to go, wow, it's really happening.
Right. I don't see it in the B2B space at all. But one company that comes to mind that I think is on that track and doing well with it is Patagonia.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah. Their participation dynamics are really good. It reminds me of a story. And it was one I heard, a bunch of years ago. But it was a company, I think it was up in Canada. And they decided, we need to, find our story, right? And really get our story straight so that we can tell it to the world. Yeah. And so they hired a company to come in to help them with their story, right? And find it. And this company went all up and down the organization and talked to all the employees and collected all of these stories, right? It's great so far. And then this company went back to their offices and sifted through all the stories and kind of figured out what the common elements were and took all of those stories, distilled them down, and created the one story, right? And then they went back to the executives at the firm and said, okay, we got it. We have your story, and presented to the executives. The executives said, oh, God, this is great. Love it. Yes, that's who we are. And so then they had this big event to roll out the story to everybody in the company. And they did. And the employees just got up in arms because they this is what they were saying. They were saying, but that's not the story I told you. But that doesn't sound like my experience here. And so the employees were saying, that's not our story. That's not the stories we told you, right?
Yeah.
And so the employees just went in total rebellion, and they went around saying, oh, yeah, we've been storied. And you go, oh, my God. I mean, your heart just sinks.
Oh, that's never good. No. That's horrible.
Yes. And I don't know that that's an extreme example.
It's not. And I wish I could say that I have not had similar conversations. I have. And you're right. I think it happens more often than not. And the way you just used storied sent chills up my spine, because we took something that is a beautiful living thing that the employees, when it's done well, rally behind because they're your biggest champions.
Right.
And you alienate and built this wall. And now they see story as nothing but an act of positioning and messaging and, PR. And getting screwed over. and getting screwed over and getting screwed over. And it's interesting because there's a big company in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, where I live, a few years ago, rebranded. And I was working with some of the employees, and boy, I got to tell you, the employees did not believe in the new branding. And they said to me, what do you think of the story? And I said, more importantly, it doesn't matter what I think. What do you guys think of your new story? And they said, it's awful, just awful. And the management didn't care because they had made a bunch of acquisitions of smaller companies, and they were trying to coalesce around a bigger story that included all these new startups that they bought.
Yeah.
The problem is that they alienated the people who were at the startups, who were like, well, what happened to our startup story? We had a really great David and Goliath, really wonderful story, underdog story, and it's gone. And the people who were at the big company, the humanity was just squeezed right out of the story. And nobody was happy. And I remember talking to the executives who looked at me, and I couldn't believe it, said, well, they'll get used to it in time. They'll get used to it. And I was like, oh, I don't think you get it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think you get it. They just do not buy into your story. And that is a huge problem for you.
It is. It goes right back to the point you made about it's participatory between you and the employees. It's co-created between you, the organization, and its employees. And you can't ever really use storytelling as a push technology when it needs to be a co-created piece, and expecting that push technology to work for you.
No, you're right. It just doesn't. I'm curious. I'm going to ask a question that's, I know, a big boiling the ocean question again. But as storytellers, I'm always curious, sort of talking to people like you, what you see and what you think. So there's a lot of debate over what makes a great story. And because you and I both, I think, look at stories, and our litmus test is higher. The sniff test is higher. And I'm curious, sort of, Karen, what do you think? What are the elements that have to be there for you to go, you know what? Yeah, this actually is a great story.
Yeah. Say those last words again, because you cut out.
What are the elements that have to be there in your mind for you to call something a great story?
Yes. Well, for me, it's some mechanical things, and then it's some heart things. You know, there's a personal relationship you need to have with the story.
Yeah.
And part of that personal relationship is the ability to step back into the experience, the original experience, and relive that story with all its messy emotions.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think, when you treat your stories with respect and honor your stories, and know that there's something in there. Well, the way I talk about it is that story that you are telling has work to do in the world. You need to honor that. And so we sometimes treat our stories like secondhand clothes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just picked that up in the thrift store, right? Or, you know, I get, oh yeah, it's a nice blouse. Thank you for telling me, and you know, I got it on sale, 50%. You know? Like, oh, let's keep discounting. Right?
Or you get it at Forever 21. It's like, because it ain't serving you.
Right. Absolutely. So there's some things around the relationship with your story that allow the magnificence of the story and the magnificence of you to shine through. Right? And you're being the vehicle for that story. So it's not about the arrogance of, oh, here, let me, be a great storyteller. It's always in service to the story, and it's in service to the audience. So when you get that relationship straight, it allows you to tap into the story in a really deep level, and you can experience that story in different ways, and it becomes a magnificent story. not just a good story, right, but a magnificent story.
Mm.
So it's sort of like the difference between improv when you're goofing around in the kitchen, right, and improv when you're on the stage. Right? You know that there are qualities and degrees of experience and difference that are important to pay attention to. So if you really want to tell a really great story, you have to move out of the conversations in the kitchen, story swapping, to being on the stage, story swapping. And so I think that's one part of it. And then I think the other part of it is knowing enough about the mechanics of the story to play with it. Right?
Yeah.
So beginning, middle, and end. Okay, so I'm going to tell the story from the end this time. I'm going to tell it backwards this time. Right? Or I know how my story starts, so let's start at the beginning. Right? No, let's start at the middle this time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And being able to play with that. And what that gives you is more excitement and joy and play and juice to tell that story. And it becomes a better story.
Yes.
You got to practice, but it becomes a better story. Right?
And I love that you said you can start in the middle, because I think that's so true. A lot of times we don't need to start way back at the beginning.
Right.
And start at the height of the action, right at the beginning, because the emotional palpitation. I'm gonna. Oh my God. Oh my gosh. And now I'm drawn in, and I think sometimes companies get tied to we got to have the beginning, middle, and end. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe we need the middle and the end.
Right.
In an open way, but maybe we don't need to start at the beginning. And so I'm even challenging some traditional notions that maybe 5-6 years ago I wouldn't have said.
Right. And then I think another really critical piece for people to realize is that all great storytellers, what they do is they tell a story from image to image to image to image. Right? They don't have this memorized, the story memorized. They have the order of the images memorized. Because if the storyteller, if I can see it in my head, then I can convey it to you when I'm telling the story. And that's a way to also spark using visual language.
Yes.
Right? Visual language is, instead of, I was sitting at my desk and the phone rang. Right? It's one day I was sitting at my desk. All of a sudden, the phone rang. And on the other end was a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. So you are painting the picture. You are feeding images to your audience. And once people get that, then the quality of their storytelling automatically starts increasing and getting better. So those are a few thoughts I have about that.
I think that's fantastic. I think it's so true, because when I think in images on a stage, it conjures up emotions for me. So when I'm telling a story through a place of emotional, an emotional place, I'm remembering it like it was yesterday. And so it's not about the words. I'm actually going back to how I felt. And I think there's something really palpable to the audience about that.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of that emotional conduit for the words. And I love that you think in images, because I do too. And that's how my brain works when I'm telling a story. And that's such great advice. I love it. I got one final question for you. And I know it's, again, these are big questions, but they're important. Storytelling is just, it's an important thing. And I'm just curious, and maybe we'll have to do a second conversation with you, Karen, because this is so much fun. I know it's one of those things that sort of storytellers sometimes, poo-poo, and some do, and I don't, because I still think there are ways to look at it. But this idea of return on investment for storytelling, I think it's important.
Yes.
Because there are, forget even just for a moment the numerical metrics, just for a moment, the human metrics, the ways that we know that stories are working. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your thoughts on that? How do you know when a story is really working, and how would you look at return? What's the framing for that for you?
Well, I think there are different ROIs for different applications.
Yeah.
But some of the things that I think of just kind of across the board. And understand that ROI for storytelling is still in its infancy. When I share a story, the one ROI that I immediately look for is the aha, the spark in someone's eyes, the sparkle in someone's eyes when they get it, right? When they say, ah, right? Yes. It's what another storyteller, Elizabeth Ellis, calls the ah, or the oh, or the aha moment, right? So that's one piece of ROI. Another piece of ROI that goes right behind that is when the person I told the story to turns around and says, oh my God, let me tell you this story to someone else. And in marketing, that's word of mouth marketing.
Yeah.
And one of my clients who was in just took one of my storytelling workshops, a couple days after the workshop, told me that she was at a networking event and somebody asked her what she did, and she had an opportunity, she realized, to share a story with them right then and there, instead of go through the usual boring statistics and data, right, and information that they share. So she did tell the story, and the woman was almost in tears listening to it. It was about how she and her husband got the business that they are owning and working today. And then my client told the woman that she was telling the story to that she was experimenting with storytelling, and the woman said, don't ever, ever again share information. Always tell that story.
Wow.
And then they're sitting at a round table a little while later, and this woman turns to somebody else at the table and shares my client's story. Wow. You know, and it was happening right in front of my client's eyes. Now that is some pretty potent ROI.
Yeah, it is.
That's immeasurable, right? I mean, well, it's not immeasurable, but it's like the MasterCard commercial, you know, it's priceless, right? That word of mouth marketing is priceless.
Yeah.
And it's how referrals come to business, right? It's through the stories that are shared and about people's experiences or what they hear. So there's ROI in terms of word of mouth marketing. There's ROI in terms of relationship.
Yeah.
There's ROI in terms of empathy.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, so now we understand each other and we're more closely bonded. There's ROI in terms of engagement, which is what you were talking about with employees. Right? It's really the employee stories that make up the organization, and valuing and acknowledging and sharing those stories are what makes a strong culture. Right?
Absolutely.
I was reading an HBR article of a couple months ago about this healthcare institute that needed to do a turnaround in terms of its customer service stats with a hospital, right? So they devoted their time to collecting stories, particular kinds of stories about working with the hospital patients. And 90 days later and 6,000 stories later, and they had completely turned their stats around, their customer service stats around, to a place that they had never experienced before.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? So that's a piece of ROI.
Yeah.
There's other ROI that has been articulated based on some research about how storied organizations, the kinds of organizations you and I have been talking about and wanting more of, how they produce more revenue than organizations that are not paying attention to storytelling. Right? So you have some bottom line ROI. So I think that there are a ton of ROI opportunities out there that we just need to, you know, think and articulate. Think about better and articulate better.
Yes, well said. And I think it really is about not just the bottom line stuff, it's the top line human measures, as I always like to say, because before you can even get to the bottom line, you got to have the human measures. And there's such a great story of how do you know it? When somebody immediately wants to share your story or tell you their story, you know you've made a connection. And I love your example because that really is what it comes down to. If you've told a story well, I really fundamentally believe that you've sparked something in that person, in that audience who's heard it, that makes them want to share their story and be a part of that. That is ultimately what it's all about, I think.
Right. It's stories travel. That's what I always say. Stories travel. Stories travel.
Karen, you're going to have to come back because you're fun. You're busy, but you're a heck of a lot of fun. And what's coming up for you that you want to share with the audience? What do you got? You got any workshops? You got any new books? What do you want to share?
Oh, well, thanks, Kathy, for asking. Well, next week I'm in Ohio, and I'm doing a 2-day women's leadership retreat with my good buddy and story colleague, Madeline Blair. And we do this 2-day retreat for women through the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce. And it sets up a whole 1-year program for them. So we're the kickoff retreat. It's all based in storytelling principles and to pull the best leadership wisdom out of the group. And Madeline and I have been doing that, I think, 6 or 7 years now. So it's a real treat. I know we got 54 women coming in. It's going to be fabulous. And
when are you doing one on the West Coast? Because I want to go.
Oh, Madeline and I are working on that. We want it here. Yes, we want it here. We've been working on that. Anybody have any ideas or referrals for us, please let us know because it's a dynamic program. And then I'm giving a Sue talk at a women's conference here in San Diego in October. Okay. So you've heard of TED?
Yes.
Right? TED Talks?
Yes.
Have you heard of Sue Talk?
I have not. Please.
It's inaugural event, right? Sue stands for Successful, Unstoppable, Empowering Women Who Are Making a Difference in Business.
Nice.
And it's a 12-minute format where we share, our powerful stories. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it's just women speaking about their business experience and sort of all the great things that we need to know about that. And so it's like, move over, Ted. Sue's coming.
Sue's coming. Exactly. There's a new 12-minute talk in town.
That's right. That's right.
I love it. What a great concept. I haven't heard of it, but I think your talk's going to be phenomenal. And for folks out there who will be hearing this, if you haven't had a chance to, please check out Karen's website. It's juststoreit.com. Check out her Business Storytelling for Dummies because it is a great book. She's been doing this a long time. She knows storytelling, and I love that she's got a PhD in folklore. So I think that's fabulous because you really understand mythology and story from the very beginning. And I think that's amazing. So, and you can follow her. If I got your Twitter handle right, it's at @KDietz, Dietz. Karen, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Kathy. This was so much fun. We have to do it again.
You bet. You're on. We're just going to have to find time in your busy schedule when you're not doing Sue Talks.
Right. That's right. All right. Well, hey, have a great rest of the day. And we'll be talking on social media, I'm sure, and emails and what have you. And I look forward to making it up to Northern California sometime soon.
I would love that. Take care, everybody. Take care, Karen. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.